No one in that ballroom knew the grey-haired woman standing silently in the back had once buried an entire town with the truth. They only saw a simple mother being humiliated by her son-in-law in front of 200 guests. He demanded the keys to my farm as a test of loyalty. He thought he was breaking me, but he had just activated a cold, legal, and irreversible machine that would strip him of everything he owned. My name is Martha Vance, and I have spent 53 years learning that the earth does not lie, but people do. Standing in the foyer of the Grandview estate, I felt like a clod of dry dirt on a pristine white tablecloth. My dress was a sensible navy blue, bought off the rack at a department store 3 towns over. It was clean and pressed, but against the silk and satin of the other 200 guests, it looked like a dish rag. I kept my hands clasped in front of me to hide the knuckles that were swollen from decades of pulling beets and fixing fences. They looked at me, the groom's friends and the distant cousins, with that polite pity city people reserve for the rural poor. They saw a weathered old woman who smelled faintly of diesel and rain. They did not know I owned every acre they were currently ignoring to talk about stocks and summer homes. I watched Clara from across the room. My daughter looked like a porcelain doll, fragile and perfect in her white gown. It cost $4,000. I knew that because I had wired the money into her account the moment she asked, even though she had not visited the farm in 6 months. She was laughing at something a bridesmaid said, but the sound was thin. It lacked the belly-deep joy she used to have when she was a girl running through the cornfields, chasing the barn cats. We had not really spoken since the engagement party. She had called me a week ago, her voice tight. "Mom? Please, just try to fit in," Richard says. Well, he says appearances matter to his clients. Richard. I turned my gaze to the man holding court near the champagne tower. Richard Sterling was everything a mother is supposed to want for her daughter. He was 32, a junior partner at a law firm, with teeth so white they looked synthetic. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than my tractor's new transmission. He was charming the room, shaking hands with a firm, practiced grip. But I had seen the way he looked at Clara when she spoke too loudly or laughed too freely. It was a look of ownership. It was the way a man looks at a prize horse that needs breaking. I walked toward them, the click of my sensible heels swallowed by the roar of conversation. When Richard saw me, his smile did not reach his eyes. It was a flat, dead thing. "Martha," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "We were beginning to wonder if the old truck made it. It runs fine." "Richard," I said, keeping my voice level, just like it has for 20 years. Clara turned to me, her eyes darting to her husband's face before settling on mine. She looked tired. Under the layers of professional makeup, I could see the shadows. She reached out and squeezed my hand, her fingers cold. "I'm glad you're here." "Mom," she whispered. "Really, you look beautiful." "Clara," I told her. I wanted to ask her why she had stopped answering my Sunday calls. I wanted to ask her why her handwriting on the invitation had been shaky, but I did not. I swallowed the questions because today was not about me. It was about her survival in this world she had chosen. "The farm," Richard interrupted, stepping slightly between us, a subtle physical barrier. "I assume the weeds are taking over, now that you are alone out there. Must be a burden for a woman of your vintage. The farm. The 300 acres of prime soil that had killed my husband and saved my soul. It was the legacy that had cost us everything, the land soaked in sweat and grief. It was the only thing I had left, the only thing that was truly mine. Richard spoke of it like it was a disease. The land takes care of itself if you treat it right, I said. He chuckled, a low, condescending sound. Well, we will have to discuss that. Eventually. Reality has to set in. Martha, you can't cling to the past forever. He put a hand on Clara's lower back. It looked like a caress, but I saw her spine stiffen. He was steering her, guiding her away from me toward a group of men in grey suits. Excuse us, Martha, he said, not waiting for an answer. Important people to meet? I watched them walk away. Clara glanced back once, her eyes wide and pleading, before she turned her head and pasted that thin smile back onto her face. She was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by orchids and crystal glasses. I took a glass of water from a passing tray and retreated to the corner. The room was loud, filled with the hum of expensive chatter. But around me, the air felt heavy and still. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a tornado touches down. I gripped my glass, my rough thumb tracing the condensation. I would be quiet. I would be the simple, embarrassing mother-in-law they expected me to be. But my eyes were open, and I was watching every move he made. The reception hall was freezing, or perhaps it was just the blood draining from my extremities. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when the speeches began. Waiters in white gloves moved silently through the shadows, refilling champagne flutes with wine that likely cost more than my monthly heating bill. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. I had survived the ceremony, the photos, and the dinner. I just needed to survive the toasts, and then I could drive the old truck back to the safety of the dirt roads where I belonged. Richard stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The sound was sharp and commanding. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled at the room. He spoke for 10 minutes about how he met Clara, about his career, and about the bright future they would build. He was charismatic and articulate. Then, the tone of his voice shifted. It dropped an octave, becoming serious and performative. But we cannot build a future without securing our foundation, Richard said, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto me. Martha, would you please stand up? My heart hammered against my ribs. I did not want to stand. Every instinct in my body told me to remain seated, to hide. But the spotlight swung around, blinding me with its white intensity. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on my cheap dress and my weathered skin. My mother-in-law, Richard announced, sweeping his hand toward me like I was a prop in a magic show. A woman who has worked hard all her life, but we all know that time comes for us all. The farm has become a heavy burden for a woman of her advanced years. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He did not open it. He just held it there. Clara and I want to relieve you of that burden. Martha, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. So, tonight, in front of all our friends and family, I am asking you to do the right thing. Hand over the keys to the farmhouse. Let us take legal responsibility for the land. Do it now, as a symbol of your blessing. Prove that you trust us. Prove that you love Clara enough to let go. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. No one moved. No one coughed. The request was so audacious, so aggressive, that the guests did not know how to react. I looked at Clara. My daughter was sitting at the head table, her face as white as her dress. She was staring at her plate, her shoulders hunched. She was terrified. She did not say a word. She did not look at me. I looked back at Richard. He was smiling, his hand extended, waiting for me to walk up there and surrender my life's work. This was not a request. This was a public execution of my independence. He knew I would be too ashamed to say no in front of his wealthy partners. He was banking on my embarrassment. I took a breath. The air smelled of expensive perfume and betrayal. No, I said. It was not a shout. It was a simple, flat statement. Richard's smile froze for a fraction of a second before it twisted into something pitying. He lowered the microphone slightly, but he made sure he was still close enough for the sound system to pick up his sigh. I was afraid of this, Richard said, shaking his head sadly at the audience. You see, this is what we have been dealing with. The confusion, the irrational attachment. I am sorry to have to say this, but Martha is, well, she is not quite lucid anymore. She is not mentally fit to manage that property. A gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw heads leaning together, whispering. They looked at me with pity now. Poor old woman. She's lost her mind. Her son-in-law is just trying to help. It's okay. Martha, Richard said, his voice soothing and condescending, like he was talking to a toddler. We will handle the legalities later. Sit down before you hurt yourself. I sat down. The humiliation was physical. It felt like a brand being seared into my chest. I stared straight ahead, refusing to cry, refusing to let him see the damage. But inside, something cold and hard was forming. He thought he had just won a public victory. He thought he had shamed me into submission. He did not know that he had just freed me from the obligation of being nice. I slipped out the side door while the waiters were serving the filet mignon. I did not say goodbye to Clara. I could not bear to see the shame in her eyes. Or worse, the relief that I was leaving. The valet looked at my rusted Ford with open disdain, holding the keys by the very tip of the metal ring as if they were contaminated. I took them without a word. The drive back to the farm took 45 minutes. As the city lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the crushing darkness of the country roads, the humiliation began to recede, replaced by the ancient, aching familiarity of the land. Richard saw the farm as an asset, a line item on a spreadsheet, something to be liquidated for quick cash. He did not know that the soil was composed of more than just nitrogen and phosphorus. It was built on bone and blood. I remembered the crash of 2008, while the rest of the country was panicking, watching their stock portfolios turn to ash. I was here, standing in the mud, making deals that saved 5 neighboring families from foreclosure. I organized the local cooperative when the distributors tried to strangle us on prices. I sat in boardrooms filled with men who smoked cigars and thought they could bully a woman in work boots. I crushed them. I did not do it with shouting matches. I did it with contracts, with leverage, and with a memory that never forgot a single decimal point. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I remembered the price I paid for that victory. I remembered the nights I went without sleep, checking the frost warnings every hour. I remembered the day Henry collapsed in the south pasture. The doctors said it was his heart, but I knew it was the land. The land takes as much as it gives. Henry. My chest tightened. I could still hear his voice from those last days in the hospital, wheezing against the fluid in his lungs. Martha, he had said, gripping my hand with a strength he no longer possessed. They will try to take it. When I am gone, they will come like vultures. Promise me. I promise. Henry, I had whispered, tears streaming down my face. Nobody touches this land but us. You are the steel. Martha. He had rasped, his eyes losing focus. You are the steel, not me. I wiped a dry hand across my cheek. Richard thought I was a confused old woman. He thought my refusal to hand over the keys was the stubbornness of senility. He had looked at my grey hair and my calloused hands and assumed I was weak. He did not know that I had buried a husband and raised a daughter while running a business that generated $2 million in revenue during a drought. He judged me by my dress, not by my ledger. The tears that had threatened to fall back at the wedding hall dried up completely. A cold clarity washed over me. It was the same feeling I used to get before a big harvest, the calm before the work began. Richard had made a fatal error. He had mistaken my silence for submission. He thought he had broken me by shaming me in front of his high society friends. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the headlights sweeping over the white siding of the farmhouse. It looked lonely in the dark, but it stood strong. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a long time. The crickets were singing in the tall grass. You want the keys. Richard, I whispered to the empty cab, I will give you the keys. But you are not going to like what they open. I stepped out of the truck. I was no longer the embarrassed mother-in-law. I was the woman who had survived blizzards, bankruptcies, and death. I walked up the porch steps, not with the heavy tread of the defeated, but with the steady, rhythmic pace of a predator that has just picked up a scent. My silence was no longer a shield, it was a strategy. The farmhouse was quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence did not feel empty. It felt focused. I walked into the small room off the kitchen that everyone assumed was a pantry. It was not. I pushed aside a shelf of canned peaches and unlocked the heavy steel door behind it. Inside, the air smelled of stale paper and ink. This was where the real work happened, to the town. I was a widow who sold vegetables at the Saturday market, to the banking sector of the Midwest. I was the former chairwoman of the Heartland Agricultural Cooperative, a position I had held for 15 years. I had negotiated trade deals with foreign governments. I had restructured debt for half the county. I retired from the public eye. But I never retired from the money. I sat down at the oak desk and opened the laptop I kept hidden in the bottom drawer. It was encrypted, unconnected to the home Wi-Fi, running on a secure satellite line I paid for through a shell company. I did not need a lawyer to understand Richard's game. I needed a forensic audit. I began to pull the threads. I had contacts auditors, clerks, and bankers who owed me their careers. I sent a single encrypted message to a contact at the Viridian Trust, a private lending institution that handled high-risk agricultural assets. It was a fictional name to the public, a holding company for the old families who ran this state. And I sat on the advisory board. The reply came within 20 minutes. Subject inquiry regarding Sterling. R. I opened the attachment. My breath hitched, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it. Richard had not just asked for the keys for sentimental reasons. He had already leveraged the farm. He had listed my 300 acres as collateral for a commercial loan worth $5 million. He had forged a letter of intent, claiming transfer of ownership was imminent due to my declining health. I picked up the secure phone on the desk. I dialed a number I had not used in 5 years. "Hello?" a gruff voice answered on the second ring. "It is Martha," I said. There was a pause, heavy and surprised. "Martha, I didn't think you were still in the game. I am not playing. George? I am hunting." I am looking at the Sterling file at Viridian. Tell me he hasn't signed the final promissory note yet. He is scheduled to sign it in 2 weeks, George said. He is waiting for the deed transfer. Martha, if he forged your signature on that intent letter, that is fraud. We can have him arrested by sunrise. No, I said, my voice cutting through the static. No police. If we arrest him now, he plays the victim. He will say he was trying to help a senile old woman manage her assets. He will spin it. Then what do you want to do? George asked. He is dangerous. He is desperate for cash. I want you to approve the preliminary strictures. I told him. Let him think the loan is clear. Let him spend the money he does not have yet. Let him dig the hole so deep he can never climb out. That is risky. Martha. If he defaults. Viridian seizes his personal assets to cover the breach of contract. I interrupted. I read the fine print. George, I wrote the fine print 10 years ago. I could hear George shifting in his chair on the other end of the line. You are terrifying when you are like this, he muttered. He humiliated me. George, I said softly. He tried to take my home. I don't want him in a cell. I want him in the gutter. I hung up the phone. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer and uncapped my fountain pen. I began to write down dates, amounts, and statute numbers. I did not feel like a mother-in-law anymore. I felt like a judge. Richard thought he was moving pieces on a checkerboard. He did not realize I had already designed the table. The phone calls started at 6 in the morning. Richard did not scream. He was too smart for that. He used silence and implication. He sent Clara to do his dirty work. When she arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, she looked like a ghost. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was twisting her wedding ring around her finger until the skin turned raw. He says the bank needs the papers by Friday. Mom, Clara stammered, refusing to meet my eyes. He says if we don't secure the asset, we could lose an opportunity. What opportunity? Clara, I asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. I don't know. Investment stuff, she whispered, her voice cracking. He yells when I ask, Mom, I am scared. He says you are being selfish. He says you are losing your grip on reality. I looked at my daughter. The vibrant girl who used to drive the tractor was gone, replaced by this trembling woman. I needed to end this, but I needed him to commit fully to the fraud first. I needed him to sign his name on the line that would ruin him. Tell him to come over tomorrow, I said, making my voice sound thin and wavering. Tell him I am ready to talk. I don't want to fight anymore. When Richard arrived the next day, he brought a lawyer I had never seen before, a young man in a cheap suit who looked nervous. Richard, however, was radiating confidence. He walked into my kitchen like he had already redecorated it. I knew you would see reason. Martha, Richard said, placing a heavy briefcase on my oak table. It is for the best. You can move into that assisted living facility in town. We have already picked out a room. It has a view of the parking lot. But it is very safe. I sat down slowly, feigning a slight tremor in my hands. I saw Richard exchange a look with his lawyer, a look of triumph. I have looked at your papers. Richard, I said, keeping my head down, but I have some conditions, just small ones, to make sure I am safe. Conditions. Richard's tone sharpened instantly. Martha, we don't have time for games. No games, I said softly. I want to make sure the farm stays in the family. So I had a friend type this up. It is a transfer of stewardship agreement. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a masterpiece of legal camouflage. On the surface, it gave Richard immediate power of attorney over the farm's operations. It looked like a total surrender. But in paragraph 4, buried in dense legal syntax, was a cross-collateralization clause. It stated that by accepting management of the farm, the manager accepted full personal liability for all existing debts of the primary holding entity, which was the farm, and pledged all personal assets as security against the farm's projected solvency. Richard did not know the farm was technically the creditor for a dormant shell company I controlled. By signing this, he was not just taking the farm, he was personally guaranteeing a debt he did not know existed. He scanned the document quickly. He saw the words, power of attorney and immediate transfer, and stopped reading. Arrogance is a powerful blinder. This seems acceptable, Richard said, pulling a gold pen from his pocket. You are finally making sense. Martha, just sign here, and we can stop all this unpleasantness. I am just so tired. Richard, I said, allowing a tear to leak out of my eye. I just want Clara to be happy. She will be ecstatic, he said, uncapping the pen. Sign. I signed my name with a shaky hand. Then I pushed the paper toward him. You too, I whispered, to accept the burden. Richard laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound, gladly. He signed his name with a flourish, pressing down hard enough to indent the paper. He thought he was signing a deed. He did not know he was signing a confession. He blew on the ink and smirked at me. See, he said, snapping the briefcase shut. That wasn't so hard, was it? Mum. No, I answered, my voice suddenly steady. It was very easy. He did not notice the change in my tone. He was too busy calculating how much he could borrow against my land. He walked out the door without looking back. I watched him go, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a trap snapping shut. He had the paper, but I had his life in my hands. 2 days later, Richard was standing in the centre of the Oakwood Country Club, holding a glass of scotch that cost $50 a shot. I was not there, of course. I was sitting on my front porch shelling peas, but I did not need to be in the room to see him. I had eyes everywhere. The waitstaff, the valet drivers, the coat check girl. Many of them were the children of families I had helped keep afloat during the recession. They were invisible to men like Richard, but they were loyal to me. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I did not save. It was a photo. It showed Richard laughing with 2 men in grey suits. I recognized them immediately. They were developers from Chicago, men who chewed up small towns and spit out strip malls. Richard was leveraging the farm to secure a partnership for a commercial complex. He was telling them the land was his, free and clear, ready to be paved over. He is promising them $15 million in equity. My contact texted. I put the phone down and picked up my landline. I dialed the private number of Silas Thorne. Silas was now a retired judge, but 30 years ago, he was a young lawyer who had made a mistake that almost cost him his license. I was the one who fixed it. I was the one who buried the evidence because I knew he was a good man who had just panicked. He owed me his life. Martha, Silas answered, his voice gravelly. I heard Richard is making noise. He is trying to sell the sky. Silas? I said calmly. He is sitting with the Venturi brothers right now. He is using my deed as a shield. "What do you need?" Silas asked. "I need a whisper." "Silas, just a whisper. Tell the older Venturi brother to check the agricultural zoning easements on the south pasture. Tell him. Tell him there might be a federal lien pending." "Is there a federal lien?" Silas asked. A smile audible in his voice. "There will be when the ink dries on the papers he signed yesterday." I replied. I hung up. The seed was planted. An hour later, the atmosphere at the country club shifted. My contact told me that the older Venturi brother had stepped away to make a phone call. When he came back, he did not sit down. He stood over Richard, his face hard. "Richard," the investor said, his voice carrying over the low hum of the lounge. "My legal team is seeing some irregularities with the collateral." Richard stood up, his smile faltering. "That is impossible. The transfer is signed. The old woman is. She is out of the picture. I have full control." "Do you?" the investor asked. "Because we are hearing rumors about a cross-collateralization clause. We are hearing that the farm is attached to a debt structure we cannot see." Richard laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "That is ridiculous. Martha doesn't even know what cross-collateralization means. She is a farmer. She grows corn. She doesn't understand finance. Check your paperwork." "Richard," the investor said, buttoning his jacket. "Until this is clarified, the 15 million is off the table." The investors walked away, leaving Richard standing alone in the middle of the room. He looked around, his face flushing red. He pulled out his phone and dialed my number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello," I said, sounding sleepy. "What did you do?" Richard hissed. "Who have you been talking to?" "I am making dinner." "Richard," I said. "Why are you shouting the Venturi deal?" They backed off. "They think there is a lien on the property." Did you say something to someone?" "I have not left the house all day." "Richard," I said gently. Maybe you just didn't read the papers carefully enough. You know how complicated these things can be for a busy man like you." "I read them," he shouted, losing his composure completely. "I am coming over there. We are going to fix this. You are going to sign a waiver, and you are going to do it tonight. You can come if you want." I said. "But Richard, drive carefully. The roads are dark." I hung up the phone. He still thought this was a misunderstanding. He still thought he could bully his way out of it. He did not realize that the people he was trying to impress were the same people who had been eating at my table for decades. He was a tourist in a town I had built, and he was about to find out that even the ground he stood on was loyal to me. By 12 o'clock the next day, the $15 million deal was dead. The Venturi brothers had pulled out completely, citing unresolved liability issues. It took less than 24 hours for Richard's carefully constructed facade of success to crumble into dust. He arrived at the farm at 2 in the afternoon. He did not knock. He threw the front door open so hard it bounced off the wall, cracking the plaster. Clara was trailing behind him, looking like she was walking to her own execution. Her face was swollen from crying, and she was clutching her purse against her chest like a shield. "You did this," Richard screamed, storming into the living room where I was folding laundry. He looked manic. His tie was loose, his hair was uncombed, and there was a wild, desperate look in his eyes that I had seen before in trapped animals. "You poisoned them. You told them something I have not spoken to anyone." "Richard," I said, smoothing out a pillowcase, "I have been here all day." What is wrong? Don't play dumb with me, he shouted, stepping close enough that I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. The Venturis pulled the funding. They said the title is dirty. They said there is a cloud on the deed because of that. That stupid paper you made me sign. He slammed a new stack of documents onto the coffee table. You are going to fix it, he hissed. Right now. This is a waiver. It nullifies the previous agreement and grants me unencumbered title. Sign it. If I get this to their lawyers by 5 o'clock, I might still be able to salvage the deal. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at Clara. She was standing by the door, trembling. Clara, I said softly, do you know what this deal is for? Clara looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear. Richard says. He says it is for an investment portfolio. For our retirement. It is not for retirement. Clara, I said, keeping my eyes on Richard. It is a commercial development. He is selling the land to build a strip mall. He leveraged the farm to cover his gambling debts from last year. Did he tell you about the $200,000 he lost in Vegas? The room went silent. Richard froze. He had never told her. He thought that secret was buried deep in offshore accounts. He did not know I had access to those too. That is a lie, Richard roared, spinning around to face his wife. She is lying to you. Clara. She is a senile, jealous old witch who wants to ruin us. Clara took a step back, looking from me to him. For the first time, I saw the doubt taking root. She saw the sweat on his forehead. She saw the vein pulsing in his neck. Richard, Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Is it true, did you gamble away our savings? Shut up. Clara. Richard snapped, his hand jerking up as if to strike her, though he stopped himself mid-motion. The threat was enough. This is business. You are too stupid to understand how finance works. Just get your mother to sign the damn paper. The mask had fallen completely. There was no charming lawyer anymore. There was only a bully who was losing control. Clara flinched as if he had hit her. She stared at him, seeing a stranger. Do not speak to my daughter that way, I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the room like a scythe. Richard turned back to me, his face twisted in a sneer. I will speak however I want. I own this family. Now sign the paper, or I swear to God, I will have you declared incompetent and thrown into a state facility by Monday morning. He was hyperventilating now. He was terrified. He needed that signature because he had likely already spent some of the advance money he was expecting. I walked over to the table and picked up the pen. I held it for a moment, letting him think he had won, letting him think his threats had worked. If I sign this? I asked slowly. Will you leave us alone for the rest of the day? Yes, Richard yelled, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Just sign it. I bent down and pretended to read the document. I was not going to sign this one. This one was actually legitimate. It would free him. I needed to stall him for just a few more hours. The final trap was already set to trigger at the close of the business day. I cannot sign this. Richard, I said, standing up straight. The date is wrong. It says the 14th. Today is the 15th. Who cares about the date? He screamed. The bank cares. I said simply, if the date is wrong, the notary will reject it. You know that. He grabbed the paper from my hand, his hands shaking so badly he nearly tore it. He looked at the date. It was correct. But in his panic, he couldn't process it. I will reprint it, he stammered. I will go to the office, reprint it, and be back in an hour. And you will be sitting right here, Do you hear me? He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, shoving past Clara without a word. The door slammed shut behind him. Clara stood in the hallway, staring at the empty space where her husband had been. She looked shattered. The illusion of her perfect marriage was lying in pieces on the floor. "Mum," she choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. I think he is dangerous." "I know." "Honey," I said, walking over and pulling her into my arms. She collapsed against me, sobbing. "I know. But it is almost over. Just wait a little longer." I held her tight, staring out the window at the dust settling in the driveway. Richard was speeding back to town to fix a typo that didn't exist. He was running out of time, and I was just waiting for the clock to strike 5. The conference room at Sterling and Associates was designed to intimidate. It was all glass walls and polished mahogany, situated on the 42nd floor with a view that made the cars below look like insects. We gathered there at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by his junior partner and a notary public. He looked refreshed, his panic from the weekend replaced by the smug assurance of a man who believes he has wrestled fate to the ground and won. Clara sat to my left. She was silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. She had not spoken to Richard since he screamed at her in our hallway. I sat opposite him, my purse in my lap, looking every bit the defeated old widow he wanted me to be. "Let's make this quick," Richard said, sliding a thick document across the table toward me. "This is the quitclaim deed. It transfers the farm, the equipment, and the land rights solely to me. Once you sign this, the Venturi deal goes through, and we can all move on with our lives. I have even included a stipend for your care facility." He uncapped a heavy fountain pen and set it down next to the paper. He did not look at me. He looked at his watch, as if I were a minor inconvenience in his schedule. "Read it, Mom," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." "Read it? There is nothing to read," Clara Richards snapped, his eyes flashing. "It is standard boilerplate. She signs. She leaves. We get rich. End of story." I picked up the pen. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. I did not read the document. I already knew what it said. It said Richard Sterling was taking ownership of everything I had. I signed my name. Martha Vance. The ink was dark and permanent. Richard let out a breath he had been holding. He snatched the paper away before the ink was even dry and handed it to the notary to stamp. "Done," he said, leaning back in his leather chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Finally. You know, Martha, for a minute there, I thought you were actually going to be a problem. But in the end, you are just a tired old woman." He turned to his junior partner. "Call the Venturis. Tell them the title is clear. Tell them to wire the $15 million. I would not make that call if I were you," a voice said from the doorway. Richard spun his chair around. Standing there was a man in a charcoal suit, holding a briefcase. It was Silas Thorne, my old friend and former judge, though Richard only saw a stranger. "Who are you?" Richard demanded. "This is a private meeting. Get out." "I am the legal counsel for the Viridian Trust," Silas said, walking calmly into the room and placing a single sheet of paper on the table. "And I am here to enforce the acceleration clause of the loan agreement you personally guaranteed last week." Richard laughed, a nervous, confused sound. What loan? I didn't take out a loan yet. We are waiting for the Venturi money. You signed a transfer of stewardship, Silas said, his voice flat and professional. That document made you the primary guarantor for the farm's existing liabilities, and by transferring the deed to your name just now, you triggered the due on sale provision of the farm's operating debt. The farm has no debt, Richard shouted, standing up. She owns it free and clear. The farm owes $5 million to the Viridian Trust, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was not weak anymore. It was cold steel. And since you just signed the deed, Richard, now you owe $5 million. Richard looked at me, his face draining of colour. What? What are you talking about? Silas began to read from the document, his voice filling the room like a judgment. Pursuant to Section 9, Paragraph C, upon transfer of the primary asset, the full balance of the principal becomes immediately due and payable. Failure to remit payment within 1 hour constitutes a default. In the event of default, the guarantor, that is you, Mr. Sterling, authorizes the immediate freezing and liquidation of all personal assets listed in the cross-collateralization agreement. This is a joke, Richard stammered, looking around the room for support. This is fraud. It is a contract, Silas corrected him, and it is already active. Suddenly, Richard's phone pinged, then it pinged again, and again. A rapid-fire series of notifications. He grabbed the phone from the table, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. What is this? He whispered, staring at the screen. Account frozen. Credit line suspended. Mortgage payment rejected. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. My accounts? I can't access my accounts. Martha, what did you do? I didn't do anything. Richard, I said, standing up slowly. You demanded the keys. You demanded the control. You wanted to prove you were the man of the house. Well, congratulations. You just bought a $5 million debt. Fix it, he screamed, lunging across the table. Undo it, I will sue you. I will kill you. His junior partner grabbed him by the shoulders, holding him back. Clara stood up, backing away from him, her hand covering her mouth. The notary was hurriedly packing her bag, trying to escape the chaos. You have 58 minutes to pay the balance. Mr. Sterling, Silas said, checking his watch. After that, Viridian initiates foreclosure proceedings on your personal residence, your car, and your partnership equity in this firm. Richard collapsed into his chair, the fight draining out of him as the reality of his annihilation set in. He had signed his own death warrant, and he had done it with a smile. The room was in chaos, phones ringing, partners shouting in the hallway, but I felt a profound, quiet peace. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed him completely. The chaos in the conference room settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. The junior partner had left to inform the managing board, and the notary had fled the moment the shouting started. Richard sat slumped in his leather chair, his face buried in his hands. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the appearance of success. And I had just stripped him naked in front of the people he tried so hard to impress. Silas walked over to Clara. He did not treat her with the pity that others had shown me. He treated her like an adult who needed to see the autopsy of her marriage. He placed a thick file on the mahogany table in front of her. It was not the deed. It was the investigative report I had commissioned weeks ago. You should look at this. Mrs. Sterling, Silas said gently. It details the online gambling accounts. It lists the dates and the amounts. $200,000 in losses over the last 18 months. It also contains the blueprints for the shopping centre he intended to build on your mother's land. There was no retirement plan. There was only concrete and asphalt. Clara stared at the folder. Her hands were trembling. But she opened it. I watched her eyes scan the pages. I saw the moment the last vestige of her denial shattered. She saw the credit card statements hidden in shell companies. She saw the emails where Richard described her family as hillbillies sitting on a gold mine. He told me the money was for an investment. Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. He said we were building a future. It's a lie. Richard lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. They forged it. Your mother. She is crazy. She is trying to destroy us because she is jealous. Clara did not flinch this time. She turned the page and pointed to a date. This was our anniversary, she said, her voice sounding hollow. You said you were working late on a merger, but this says you were at the casino in Detach, losing $5,000 on blackjack. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was written in black and white, stamped with bank authorization codes. He looked around the room, realizing there was no one left to charm. The power dynamic had shifted violently. He was no longer the successful attorney. He was a liability with a $5 million debt hanging over his head, due in less than 1 hour. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city skyline. I felt no joy. I felt no rush of adrenaline. Revenge, when executed correctly, is not hot. It is cold. It is a balancing of scales that should never have been tipped. Richard, I said, keeping my back to him. The Viridian Trust will seize your assets by noon. Your partnership here is finished. Your credit is destroyed. You will likely face disbarment for fraud once the board sees these documents. I turned around to face them. But I am not a monster. I continued. I am a businesswoman. I can offer a stay of execution on the foreclosure of the farm. I can stop the bank from seizing this house, provided the current owner is responsible. I looked at my daughter. She was standing now, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked between the man she had married and the mother she had abandoned. Clara, I said, I am going back to the farm. The truck is downstairs. You have a choice. You can stay here with him. You can help him fight the lawsuits, the debt collectors, and the shame. That is your right as his wife. I paused, letting the weight of the room settle on her shoulders. Or you can come home, I said simply. I will not say I told you so. I will not mention his name again. But you have to walk out of that door right now, and you cannot look back. Richard scrambled out of his chair. He reached for Clara's hand, his grip frantic. Clara, baby, don't listen to her. He begged, sweat dripping down his forehead. We can fix this. I just need you to talk to her. Tell her to stop. We are a team. Remember? Till death do us part. Clara looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at the gold wedding band that she had polished every morning. Then she looked at his eyes. For the first time, she saw what I saw. She saw the fear, not for losing her, but for losing his safety net. You don't want me, Clara said, her voice shaking with a sudden, terrible grief. You just want the shield. No, that isn't true, Richard cried. Clara pulled her arm away. It was a small movement, but it severed the last thread holding them together. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving with the effort of not breaking down completely. "I am sorry, Mum," Clara said, turning to me. "I am so sorry." "Do not apologize," I said, my face impassive. "Just choose." Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at Richard one last time. There was no hate in her eyes, only a profound disappointment that was far worse than anger. She turned her back on him and walked toward me. "I am coming home," she said. Richard screamed something as we walked out, a string of profanities and threats. But the heavy glass doors slid shut behind us, cutting off the sound. We walked to the elevator in silence. I did not hug her. I did not comfort her. She needed to stand on her own 2 feet, even if they were shaking. I pressed the button for the lobby. The revenge was complete. I had not shed a single drop of blood, but I had killed the man my daughter thought she married. The fall of Richard Sterling was not a loud explosion. It was a slow, suffocating slide into irrelevance. It took exactly 6 months for the legal system to finish what I had started in that conference room. The foreclosure on his assets was swift and merciless. The Viridian Trust, acting on my instructions, seized his luxury condominium, his sports car, and his frozen bank accounts to satisfy the debt he had foolishly guaranteed. The local bar association launched an ethics investigation after receiving an anonymous package containing his altered client ledgers. He was disbarred 3 weeks later. The last I heard, he was living in a rented studio apartment on the south side of the city, working as a paralegal for a strip mall ambulance chaser. He had ceased to be a predator. He was now just prey. The farm, however, had never been more alive. The debt I had used to trap him was easily restructured, moving from one of my ledgers to another, a simple accounting trick for a woman who owned the board. We had a bumper crop of soybeans that fall. The silos were full, and the equipment was humming. Clara was learning the books. She was no longer the fragile doll in the white dress. She wore denim and flannel, and her hands were beginning to develop the protective calluses that define our kind of life. She did not talk about Richard. She did not ask about the past. She just worked, finding her own rhythm in the cycle of the seasons. I stood on the edge of the north pasture at 5 o'clock in the morning. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and drying hay. This was my favorite time of day, the grey hour before the sun broke the horizon. It was quiet. There were no lawyers here. There were no contracts, no lies, and no social climbers trying to steal what they could not earn. There was only the land, indifferent and eternal. I looked out over the 300 acres that had almost been lost. I did not feel a surge of triumph. Triumph is a fleeting emotion, a sugar rush for the ego. What I felt was something deeper and colder. I felt balance. I had not destroyed Richard because I hated him. I had destroyed him because he was a weed. He had tried to choke the life out of my family, so I had pulled him up by the roots. It was not personal. It was necessary agriculture. "Mum," I turned to see Clara standing on the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. The shadows that had haunted her face on her wedding day were gone. "You are up early," she said, walking down the steps to join me in the tall grass. "The day does not wait for us to be ready." "Clara," I replied, taking the mug she offered. "It comes anyway." She stood beside me, looking out at the horizon where a thin line of orange was beginning to bleed into the indigo sky. "Do you think he thinks about us?" She asked quietly. I don't know, I said, taking a sip of the hot coffee, and it does not matter. He is yesterday. We are today. She nodded, accepting the truth of it. We stood there in silence as the sun finally crested the hills, flooding the fields with golden light. The farm glowed. It was a fortress built of dirt and will, and it was still standing. The town would talk for years about the wedding and the scandal. They would whisper about the grey-haired woman who took down a high-flying lawyer without raising her voice. Let them talk. I did not need their approval. I had my land. I had my daughter. And I had the keys in my pocket. The revenge was complete, not because he was suffering, but because we were thriving. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold morning air. The world was right again. The account was settled. And as the light touched my face, I knew that no one would ever dare to cross the threshold of my gate again without permission. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are all tuning in from today. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts with the community. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Nora Revenge Stories channel, hit that like button, and give us a hype to help this video reach even more people.